Okay, now you're recording.
Gracias.
All right, now we want to go to your share again.
Yeah,
Share screen.
I might,
Right here.
yeah.
Yay! You also have closed caption on.
Awesome. Thank you. So,
Sorry.
oh, did I get
No,
No worries, no worries. So my goal here today is really just to move the needle, hopefully in the right direction, right? Yeah, we definitely don't want to move it in the wrong direction. But, you know, I was talking to this environmental organization recently, and they were talking, well, we just want to try to make this perfect. And I'm like, there's no such thing, right? I have a diversity statement for my lab. I'm recruiting a graduate student right now. I hope to change it and improve it the next time I have it. There will be things that I continue, right? I'm not going to start from scratch, but I'm going to continue to try to make it better. I encourage that with any diversity statement, by the way. Ask questions. Let's see if we can, assuming I don't take up all the time, and you can give me like a, what, the 11:30 mark, and then at the 11:40 mark, I'll leave at least 10 minutes for Q&A. You can unmute yourself. This is being recorded. See if it's being recorded, so everyone's aware of that. Please be respectful and don't gaslight people. One of the biggest things that I see in these meetings, on an almost weekly basis, is gaslighting occurring. The gaslight occurs, and that is, when someone shares their experiences and how they at least perceived an event, and someone else saying that's not actually what happened. I'll give you an example. This happened at the University of Montana. It's happened at my previous institution. I was asked several times by fellow faculty what kind of Spanish classes I taught, because obviously, that's what Latino professors can teach, right? No way they could teach biology. One person, I shared this with a colleague of mine, who's a good colleague and friend, and really truly appreciate her, and she's a believer in me and supporter. But she said, well, they probably just thought that because you always wear those shirts. I'm like, I do. I always wear Guayaberas when I teach. Not Fridays I don't. Those are my polo days. That's my laid back version. Guayaberas are how I represent my culture. My dad used to dress me up in them, although I didn't really know that. So I was sharing the story with my mom. And what I like about them is, well, obviously they're colorful, and I can kind of express a little bit of my cultural identity, especially in a field that's dominated by people of Western European ancestry and men, right? I also like them because they're straight cut, so they hide the beer belly really nice. So even though I gained weight over COVID, they still they give me a little growth there. I tell people I'm still a growing boy. So, if someone should share a story here or in the future of how they interpreted a situation, just accept that, right? You don't have to accept that, it's up to you whether you decide to accept that was true or not, but at least accept that that's their experience. I consider myself a conservation biologist that teaches wildlife biology. The science is the same, the history is a little bit different. Conservation is much more broad and considers the whole ecosystem, including plants, animals, nitrogen, the relationships, and we're honest about our ethics. We have an actual ethical viewpoint, and things that aren't necessarily based 100% in science, like biodiversity is good. What does that mean? We know that biodiversity has benefits for ecosystems, but saying that it's good, that's an ethical viewpoint, right? And so that is what I ascribe to be, that I believe that biodiversity has intrinsic value in and of itself, outside of what we can get from it. We know this, and we know that biodiversity is important for ecosystems to function. And the more you remove organisms and interactions in the ecosystem becomes less stable. But what we're barely starting to talk about in the last 2 years is human diversity. I workshop this with some of my biology students, and sometimes I get the feeling that some of them are like, this has nothing to do with wildlife biology. Why are we talking about this? And so, because they don't necessarily believe me, their professor, I say this is the professional magazine for wildlife biologists. This is the cover from this year, May and June, and the entire edition was talking about human diversity and conservation. Dr. Sarah Hoagland, who is an affiliated faculty here at the University of Montana, wildlife biology, is probably the most prominent wildlife biologist that happens also to be Native American. She was the first woman to get a PhD, a Native American woman to get a PhD in forestry in the entire United States. She's around my age, by the way. I'll be croning her later today. I don't think people of color or people that are underrepresented, whether it be women or whether it be people that are non-binary or queer, should have to explain why their presence is important in a profession. But people often get asked that, why should we care? That should be evident. But for those, especially my wildlife biology colleagues and across the field, across the United States, I'm not talking about here from Montana, and prospective students or current students, people care about this. This is the regional director of the U.S. Forest Service, now retired, was talking about, that we care about biodiversity. But we also need to think about and care about human diversity. And then it's all our jobs to make our field profession more diverse. This is what I was just getting about, diversity, not having BIPOC or people of different race or creeds or religion have to defend themselves, why they have a right to exist, which gets asked a lot. Even if I were to write an article about this, I have to, in my introduction, I have to say, who cares? I'd have to include some version of why we ought to care. It's why I had that previous slide. It's why I brought this magazine today. I had this, sometimes people will be like, well, again, it's really not my job to work on this. Okay, well, fine, don't work on it. Be aware of it. It'll make you a better biologist. I was at a regional conference, wildlife conference once, and this Native American, to me, there was an elder, perhaps she wasn't, but she was a Western trained scientist and Native American tribal member, and with the Nez person. She was talking about the hope of reintroducing California condors along the Snake River. California condors were historically there somewhere from 200 to 500 years ago. We're not really sure when, but within relatively, 3 to 500 years ago. And that legacy knowledge is there amongst the Nez person. And someone from a government organization raised his hand, and the guy was probably in his 30s, and he actually had a leadership position in this government organization, raised his hand and said, who cares? This is why I train my freshman wildlife biology students to care about this. So you don't make that faux pas, right? That was a rude way to ask a question anyways. But this now is going to hinder his agency and this person to work with this tribe, right? Also one of the reasons I consider myself a conservation biologist. Conservation biologist wouldn't ask that question. I talk about privilege because we have people here that probably understand privilege pretty well, and we have some that don't. Privilege is some sort of advantage that you get for some sort of situation that you probably had little control over, right? I walked up the stairs today. I didn't, it was not my choice. I didn't work to be able to have legs. I was born with that ability. That is a privilege I have. I don't wear glasses yet. That's privilege I have. There's all kinds of privileges. Privileges that I use this to relate to students, so people are willing to lean in and start considering their privileges. I'm a US citizen. Some of my students never thought of that as a privilege. My passport gets me into most countries without having to, go through a long visa process. I'm a heterosexual male. I accept the gender that I was assigned with at birth. I had the opportunity to go to college. I had one parent that graduated high school. And something that's weird to talk about, I am lighter complected than two of my brothers. Both parents, all same parents, right? And I've seen how we navigate the world differently because of that. And yeah, my brothers that are darker complected have it harder than I do. So maybe people in the chat and maybe here, I'm going to give you a minute to think about this. Ask yourself, does having privilege mean that your life has been easy? Think in your head, what are some privileges you may have? And what are some privileges that you, up until maybe this point, or privilege or things that you may or may not be privileged for, but things that aren't often thought about as privilege, like, but walking up the stairs one is not one that's typically thought about privilege, but we have several buildings on this campus that do not have elevators. It breaks my heart a little bit that my mom's not ever going to see my awesome, cool office. It's really cool office, come by my office. Now, if someone comes into my office and thinks I'm a Spanish professor, if they come into my office, I would totally understand that. Okay, that totally makes sense. So, does having some level of privilege mean that your life has been easy? Any level, any level. Yeah, right? You can have privilege in one area and not a privilege in another area. Does that mean because you had a hard life, other people haven't had other barriers? No, we have different barriers. And people don't like to hear this. Some people have more barriers than others. I had classmates that had to pay out-of-state tuition because they were undocumented when I was in college. And we spoke Spanish, saying culturally we're identical. I was born in the United States. They were brought here as babies or toddlers. It's a privilege that I had. Heck, I could even apply to federal loans. They didn't even have that option. What other privileges do people have in this arena? The space right now we're in. No one ever likes to share their privilege. Yeah. Having access to healthy water, that's a privilege. Having access to, a bed to sleep in. Having access to knowing that you're here today. There is a privilege there. Why aren't you, working right now? Why aren't you, even if you've made a decision to say, I could be studying or working, I decided to come here today, right? You had still that opportunity to make that decision. Some people really don't, right? I have a privilege to here to, be able to speak to you all today. I also want you to consider as you go through life, start acknowledging and thinking about, sorry, I was looking at the chat. Oh yeah, someone online said, yes, yes to privilege being easy if not noticed. Yeah, it's really easy to not notice your own privilege. But people that don't have privilege in a certain area, they think about it all the time, right? Whatever that happens to be. I love the Missoula area, and I had the opportunity to go elsewhere if I wanted to recently. I decided to stay here because I love what I do and I love what I teach, and it's a great wildlife program. But I missed that I can't go Latin dancing like I used to, everywhere I had before in my, entire adult life. I can't turn on the radio and listen to the music that I want to listen to. Luckily, I can, we have the internet now and I can listen to my music that way. In the wildlife profession, if you look at the people who get hired, I don't know why this moved around. Oops. I don't know what's the previous. Still think I'm gonna have that issue in a second, but technician jobs. These are entry-level positions. They are heavily skewed to white Americans, followed by Asians, and then Latinos, African Americans or Black Americans, and then Native Americans. That connection to Native Americans, that always made sense to me. I've yet to meet, a tribal community that doesn't have a strong affinity for their ecosystems and their homeland. And we haven't been doing a good job of recruiting and encouraging people in this field, in part because there's that distrust. We probably have people on campus whose grandparents were removed from their families and not allowed to speak their languages, right? So there's that distrust. And I think we should acknowledge that, right? And we should understand that if we want to improve conservation and diversity profession, we first have to develop credible relationships with tribal members and communities. If you look at agencies that hire wildlife biologists, it's even worse. Look at the numbers from technicians to actually people that have essentially permanent jobs. It's over 80%, and it's only 90% white, even though the public isn't that white. Trying to access, figuring out who had a hard time trying to find out recent data on graduation numbers, right? This should be easily accessible, and I couldn't find this. I know I should have prepped early. If I would have started a month ago, I probably would have been able to find it. But I think a week is enough to be able to spend, be able to find this data. I know it's available out there. I'm just gonna think I have to go through some sources and emails, and it's gonna be a little longer. But this is looking at people, getting degrees in the wildlife profession, natural resource profession. And you can see up until the 90s, there was almost no diversity. I still get pushback sometimes. Again, why does it matter? Sometimes I'll get it from women. And I'll say, well, women in this profession field are well represented at entry-level positions. But as soon as you move to supervisory positions, they are underrepresented. Asian Americans for the population are a little bit better represented, but still not, their representation in the United States, followed by Latinos, and Native Americans and African Americans are barely represented in our field. The same is true, I'm gonna move through this a little bit, the same is true for environmental organizations. Heavily more diverse in the internships, less diverse as you go up into leadership. My personal perspective, I do this a lot. Sometimes it's to my benefit, sometimes it's to my detriment. I always like bringing personal stories. If it wasn't for social media, I wouldn't know very many biologists, conservation biologists of color. And even to this day, I know more biologists of color that I've trained that I know in person, people that I actually know that I've met face to face, right? I've trained more biologists of color than I've met outside of academia. I attended 3 universities, got 3 different degrees, was in college for a long time. Whatever the average was, I was above that for every degree. It took me a little longer. In part because I choose to do diversity, equity issues and work on some of this stuff. I never had a professor of color, even though I went to 2 large state schools on the West Coast. Never had a professor of color teach any of my STEM classes, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Never had a Latino professor, period. Not even in my Spanish classes. I'm one of the few Latino wildlife biology PhDs in the entire country. I'm trying to think of who else. One guy's retired. And then the other, Dr. Garcia. 2. So I know, so 2 others besides me. Yeah. literally one of the few. It's one of the reasons I wear my shirts. You know, I have to spend a lot of time trying to get buy-in from people. I wish I didn't. I get buy-in from some, but not from all. I want a majority where people are like, yes, of course, obviously, we need to work on this issue. Increasing diversity will increase talent in our field. It'll help us ask more complex questions, come at things slightly different. We know this in business, we know this in research. When you have different perspectives, you come up with more unique, innovative solutions. I had a colleague of mine who's Native American, and he's now the head biologist for the Colville Reservation in northeastern Washington. And we were talking about catch and release fisheries. And I said, no, I've never heard, his perspective on this. I'm curious what his perspective is. So I asked, and I did not get the answer I was expecting. He was totally against it. He said, why would you play with an animal and then release it? You're gonna catch it, you should consume it. That's a perspective that, from my Western upbringing, I didn't have, and I appreciate that effort. I'm not saying that's a monolith either, that's his perspective. I'm not even saying it's Strive's perspective, but I appreciated it. And it did get me to start thinking, I'm like, I wonder what the death rate of fish that, if a fisherman that goes, catches 2 fish, goes home versus the death rate of the, fisherman that goes, catches 20, but releases all of them. Bet you, it's the same, or close to it. Dr. Sarah Hogan, who's on here, is an affiliated faculty and an expert in diversity in the wildlife field, says that we haven't done a good job of recruiting Indigenous people in the wildlife profession, and that we need more mentors. It would help to have mentors of color, it would help to have Native American mentors, but anybody can be a mentor, right? And being willing to promote this field and be understanding. I'm gonna skip through that. There's a little video on bias. I'm gonna go through that. And I will say that we all have biases. We all have biases, myself included, everyone here, my students, sometimes students will be like, no, I don't see color. I don't see, that's what I always say. Then I'm invisible. I'm glad I'm wearing clothes, because then you wouldn't see me at all. And so I was like, well, let's look at data. I'm a data guy, right? This is a guy got trained, and I like what does good questions asked, good experiments done, surveys done, what does this show us? And there's been several studies, a prominent one from 2004 using identical resumes when applying for jobs, one with an African-American sounding name, one with a more traditional white sounding name. And guess who got more callbacks for interviews? Guess who got more callbacks, got more requests for, further information or a phone call or something like that. This was across different disciplines. This work has been repeated and it's shown the same thing. There's a bunch of work on this, but some people just say, I don't see it either. Personal story. I have a friend who's working on a paper right now on wildlife, and they used her resume when applying to jobs, but they changed her name, and they had one with a white woman's name and a white man's name. Real resume, just the names changed, sent out to jobs. Guess what version of her resume got more callbacks? The one with the name that was sounded like a man. This hasn't been published yet, by the way, right? So this is like right now. It's still a problem in our field. Probably part of it is because a lot of people are doing hiring aren't women. When I was applying to jobs, no joke, I spent a few months thinking about, do I put that accent in my name or not? Because my first name is already gender neutral, Erim in English, Erim in Spanish. And I thought, I don't want to work for a place that would even not, see that as a red flag. And some people totally might be a red flag. And we're like, oh my God, this guy's gonna come in with Guayaberas to teach. They wouldn't, no one knows what, very few people know what they call Guayaberas, right? But it's something that I had to think about. If you've never had to think about altering your name or writing your name down, that's a privilege. You know, like, you know, earlier I kind of skipped the bias section, but, you know, recognize when you do find yourself having biases, to acknowledge them. When you acknowledge them, you're more likely to be able to stop doing it. If you say you don't have any bias, then you're just going to keep on doing it. And all the evidence suggests that we all have biases. You know, continue to learn. This is a journey. We're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes. I use examples of the mistakes that I make, right? Made some today. I'll probably look back at this in a few years and be like, oh, I should have mentioned this or that, right? It's okay. It's not about being perfect. It's about moving the needle, moving the ship. You know, coming to events like this, you could have done all a number of things. You decided to be here. I appreciate that you decided to share your time with me. That's the most precious resource we have is time on this earth. And so I deeply appreciate that you're here. You know, acknowledge when you find yourself having a stereotype, whatever that may be. Call other people out, especially if you're in whatever the predominant culture is. If I'm a man and we're in a group and I can speak up for women, I ought to do that. As a faculty of color, I ought to speak up about my students of color and the things that they need. Does that mean that I am tackling every single thing that I think we need to address? No, I'm trying to be strategic about some things. That's a part of it. Is that fair that I have to be strategic about some things? No, I should be able to kind of, you know, address everything I want to. But I used to advise a Latino student organization for 10 years at Washington State, huge Latino student organization. And I said, it wasn't fair that we had to pick our battles. But I've been more effective being strategic with the battles that I pick. And that's going to be different battles for different people. Now, this is where I get buy-in from almost all my wildlife students, which I think is funny because I'm like, oh, now this affects them. So they definitely see this as a problem. Up until relatively recently, no one was talking about this. There was a paper published in 2015, which is recent in the scientific field. And they were looking at 96 short-term positions, type positions my freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors are applying to. 2, 3 months, 6-month positions. 54, I don't know why they came up, I'm redoing the study, but they broke it up into $300. $300 wasn't a lot back into 2015, but I'm guessing that's how little some of these jobs were paying. Some of them paid above, 54% paid above $300. I don't know where you can live for $300. 30 were unpaid. 8 you had to pay to work. And 8 were unclear. They shouldn't even allow those. That shouldn't even be postable on a big job website. What does this mean? Why is this a problem? What's the problem here? Why do almost all my students care about this? You want to know? Gatekeeping financially. Yeah, man. I remember not being able to apply to jobs or positions because I had to work. So now, when I'm working with students, I will create, I'm an assistant professor, still trying to get, my own grant funding and get going, and I have limited funds. I worked with a couple students this summer where they were able to have a job here in Missoula, and they were able to spend 4 to 6 hours a week on a project that they will see through completion. Their data set looks huge. Actually, I have a meeting with them later. And I worked with them to be able to do that so they could afford to work and afford to do good research, right? that's something that I do because of the experience I have. I specifically am okay with bringing on students that can only do research for a few hours a week. And I work together, with that student so they can have access to, getting that research. And the research is good. They don't need to do any more. That for what they're doing, they're answering the question. Actually, they're going to be able to show you a lot of questions. Well, I have to stop asking questions. There's so much data actually. But it keeps people that don't have funds into access to the field, right? Having a car, trying to get a tech job as a wildlife biologist, seasonal job without a car is pretty hard. Not having experience in the outdoors. I didn't learn how to swim until I was an adult. And every time I've gone to swim classes in Ashland, Oregon, or in Pullman, Washington, all my classmates were all people, adults of color. Because we didn't have access to the same, pools in our communities, or classes in our communities. Still not a very good swimmer, which is bad because I work mostly in aquatic ecosystems. You know why I tried to learn how to swim? I was actually got into a lab where I was doing lake research. I'm like, I should probably learn how to swim. I'm not even joking, totally lazy. I could float. It's like, maybe I should swim. Everyone here will likely be in a position, or always been in a position, where you will hire people. If you focus, like in the wildlife profession, on experience only, and not ask what challenges that people have overcome, you're going to get the people that were able to volunteer, that are able to get those internships, that didn't have to work during the school year, right? It's not going to represent the people who actually want to get into this field. In my graduate, I'm working on a graduate student right now. After the 2-line description of what it's about, that's a master's position working with this bird and this question. I have a diversity statement. I do that on purpose. I want them to know, I want the perspective to know that diversity is important to me and to my lab. And I share what diversity means for our lab, the Gomez lab. And then I talk about more detail about the position. And I give the opportunity for students to share a diversity statement if they wish. I'm not going to require it. Some people require it. Maybe it's, some of my colleagues require it. I'm like, I feel a little weird requiring it, but I'm going to give that option if someone wants to talk about it. I'm going to ask if they challenges they've overcome. Do they have, a sick parent while they were finishing up college and that hurt their GPA, right? Did they have to work 35 hours a week so they don't have the best GPA, right? Man, give me someone that knows how to handle all that and gets above a 3-point. Now I want that person in my lab. They know how to handle stress and all that stuff. But you might not get that in a traditional grad school application or in a job application. Ask yourself, what is your hiring statement? What's the organization's, what's your hiring statement? What's your hiring statement when it comes to diversity? What opportunities are you creating for people that haven't been able to access your profession? It doesn't again matter what profession you're in. Let's get that. We do a lot of stakeholder work to the chagrin of my students in wildlife. They think this is all wildlife, but when you manage wildlife, you're really managing people oftentimes, how they use a resource, how they use the landscape. And historically in our field, we've only been asking a certain group in the United States, white men. Well, that's not what the United States is looking like anymore, right? And it's actually a problem in conservation because we fund a lot of conservation through hunting fees, through sales tax on hunting equipment and fishing equipment, and that number is not declining. And because that number is declining, the amount of money we have for conservation is actually declining as well. We want to solve these ecological problems, maintain our biodiversity. We're going to have to think about different ways of funding conservation. Some people are doing it to try to broaden the field of hunting. I can tell you my brother, who is a hunter, I'm not much of a hunter anymore these days, but my brother's a hunter, doesn't feel as safe going out in the field, as I do, because he's darker complected. think about, for the scientists in here, think about incorporating traditional ecological knowledge, especially when we teach like what science is. Science to me, the way I define it is making an observation, kind of testing that and being able to predict a future outcome. That's science to me. That's why we like science, is our predictability of the future. Because that's like, well, that doesn't sound like science. Yeah, so we know if we take Tylenol, it'll have certain effect, right? We know if we have clouds, during, with certain conditions, it might be a little cooler that day, right? Or we might get rain if it's, depending how heavy it is, right? It's our ability to predict. And there's a lot of traditional ecological knowledge out there. We have to be respectful and not just come into rooms and be like, give it to me. Because that happens. Give it to me. And then even when they do, then go publish it without acknowledging where you got the source from. Build those relationships first. People have said, since I was an undergrad, and that equity is important. But then that's where the conversation stops. What are you doing for equity? And what is your organization doing for equity in your profession or your field? Is there money behind it? Or is it just a statement? Are people actively stopped from doing this? I had my advisor in graduate school totally supported me when I wanted to work on DEI issues. And also supported me when I said, hey, I don't want to work on this particular stuff because I'm trying to finish my dissertation. Great, tell him I won't, that your advisor won't let you do it, right? And he would help as a barrier for me, right? But then I had another professor, actually program leader, said, all that other stuff you do, that advisor stuff, the volunteering and all that, you gotta stop doing that. You're a scientist, stick to being a scientist. And the sad part is that actually came when he was giving that advice, it came from a good place. He was concerned that I wasn't being enough of a scientist and he wanted to model me as what he thought a traditional scientist should be. He wasn't doing it to be me. I wouldn't be teaching here if I listened to his advice right away. Because I got hired specifically, not because I was a person of color, but specifically for my student development experience. Because I teach 2 student development courses in the wildlife program. Fish and Wildlife Careers and Fish and Wildlife Interest Group. If I hadn't done that, if I hadn't gotten that experience, I would not have been as competitive. When I saw this, actually, I didn't even realize, it wasn't until I got the actual description of the classes that I'm like, oh, these are student development courses. I thought I was like teaching, general intro biology, because that's how I read it. And then, a topics course. We all have a role to play in this. I think I have some time for some questions. Just a couple things we'll mention before we end is that it's really a journey, right? We're gonna make mistakes. We're not gonna get it perfect. Lean in, listen to people, show up like you did today. Well, it might be hard. Try to call people in if we can. Sometimes we got to call people out, but I prefer calling people in. Is that fair? No, not fair. It ends up falling on the people of color or the people that aren't represented or the queer members of the community or the women in the group, to do that work. And it is not fair. But when you can be strategic about certain things and pick your battles, I've had success. And if there had been more people like me and like you, in these professions 2 generations ago, we wouldn't barely be talking about it. And we're really just starting in the last 2 years. Think about why the last 2 years. What happened in the last 2 years that we're talking about? What incident? I'm not going to bring it up just because I don't want to bring bad imagery for people, but what incident happened? This literally cost a life for us to start talking about this. Thank you so much. I'll stick around and answer questions. I'll sit down I'll repeat questions for anyone in the group here, or if you have a question, can we hear them on the?
No one watching their chat.
Yeah.
I mean, they could unmute if you want to.
Yeah, they're welcome to unmute if they want to. You're also welcome to follow me on my Instagram if you want to know what goes on in my life and in my classes. And it goes anywhere from scary looking insects to pictures of really cool wildlife to drone demonstrations. Like yesterday I was doing, I love my job. Oh my God. Last week we were learning about grizzly bear biology. Yes.
Could you go back to the slide with the Native Americans and the conservation field? Like what percentage that is?
I can send you this if you want.
Yeah. that'd be good.
So that's in the agencies. I actually tried to look at I didn't have, there's a paywall access to those actual numbers. So I could only get, I actually wanted to make my own graph, but I just copied it. And it's, the source is, this was the American Wildlife Values source for that one. That's in agencies and that's in like technician jobs, and this is zippa.com. But you can look at, they're underrepresented even for the proportion of their population in the United States. Thank you, Nicole. Does anyone have experiences in their field that like you'd want to pose a question about and say, what would you do in this situation or anything like that? Yes.
As a young, professional, I feel like this summer I was recruiting for conservation for a young, not male person, in my opinion. And I found it really hard, as someone who want to make an impression, you want to show how hard you're working, how to bring up that conversation of see, they have these statements of diversity and equity, and how do you bring that up and still not make them uncomfortable, but also it's really important to me that those things get.
First, I want to say that it sucks that you're in that position because, so the question was, you're trying to get more, was it gender diversity in their profession?
Yeah, I meant just diversity in general.
Gender diversity and diversity in general. How do you bring that up when you're just kind of an entry level position? You got to be careful, right? You're in a very precarious state, in that where you're trying to build connections, trying to get experience. Hopefully in a good world, in a world where you have good supervisors might not know or might not be thinking about these issues. This is where I get more positive feedback when I say, hey, so I was thinking maybe we could do this. Sometimes I lead it, that's not always fair. Or sometimes you ask them to lead it or suggest to them something they can do and present it as an opportunity for the organization. That's the part of calling people in versus calling people out, you have to limit how much you do that to a degree because you don't want it to be, I had to make a decision whether in my career, was I going to be working on some of these things? Or am I just going to stick to my science? I wanted to go to grad school for political science. So I almost, I was double major as an undergrad. But I'm I like these issues. I care about these. But not every, professional of color or non-binary person or queer person should be expected to work on this. But if you can, I encourage you to do that. If you have allies, I encourage you to, find those allies and support them. And sometimes you will find fake allies that say, yeah, we totally want, they will say all the right things until there needs to be action. The moment there's action, then all these allies start disappearing. And be aware of that, things have, I would say things have gotten better. We're talking about it. Is that enough? No. But we weren't talking about this 4 years ago. Not really, and so that we're talking about it, it's made some progress. And I guess since we all have privilege to some degree, because we're here on this campus, either as a student or an employee, let's make sure that the people coming after us don't have to fight those battles. But protect yourself, take care of yourself. You're not going to solve all the world's problems by yourself. Do you have any other Q&A? I think that to respect people's time, I'm going to end it here, but You're welcome to, I'm gonna put my email in the chat. If you want to shoot me an email, if you want this presentation. And I'll stick around. So thank you very much. Yes,
Do you prefer
the accent, yes. There's like 3 things you have to press on your computer to be able to use it. I always just copy and paste. Thank you.
I always copy paste too, because I grew up in French immersion and
Oh,
so
yeah.
there's so many different ones and I didn't realize that you could utilize the keyboard. to
Yeah, I
access
always
something.
copy and paste anyway. I need to do a shortcut. Because you can
Yeah.
change it, you just make it, I need to do a shortcut.